Imagine being at the top of your profession, known worldwide for your incredible skills, only to walk into a room where the most powerful military leader refuses to let you save his life, not because you lack talent, but because of something you cannot change about yourself. This is the true story of a surgeon whose hands could perform miracles, but whose identity sparked a battle that would reshape history itself. In 1944, when the world was torn apart by the deadliest war humanity had ever seen, one phone call would test everything. Two men believed about honor, prejudice, and what it truly means to save a life. What happened next would shock the medical world and prove that sometimes the greatest victories happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see past our differences. This is not just a story about surgery. It's about the moment when expertise meets prejudice, when life hangs in the balance, and when one decision changes everything for generations to come. Charles Drew was finishing his evening rounds at Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C., when the phone rang. It was March 15, 1944, and the war in Europe was reaching its most critical phase. The voice on the other end was crisp, official, and carried the weight of military authority. Dr. Drew, this is Colonel Matthews from Walter Reed Army Medical Center. We have an urgent situation that requires your immediate attention. Drew paused, setting down the medical chart he had been reviewing. At 39 years old, he had already revolutionized blood banking and plasma storage, innovations that had saved thousands of Allied soldiers' lives. His techniques for preserving blood plasma had become the gold standard across military hospitals, and his reputation as a surgeon was unmatched. Yet something in the colonel's voice suggested this call was different from the usual consultations. "What can I do for you, Colonel?" Drew asked, already reaching for his coat. "We need you here within the hour. General William Patterson has been brought in with severe internal injuries from a Jeep accident near the Pentagon. The situation is critical, and frankly, Dr. 15. Drew, you're the only surgeon we trust with this operation." Drew felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency surgery. General Patterson was one of the most decorated officers in the European theater, a man whose strategic decisions had influenced major Allied victories. If he was calling for Drew specifically, it meant the general's condition was beyond the capabilities of Walter Reed's usual surgical team. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Drew replied, already mentally preparing for what lay ahead. The drive through the darkened streets of Washington was eerily quiet. Wartime blackout procedures meant most windows were covered, and the usual bustle of the capital had settled into the subdued rhythm of a nation at war. As Drew navigated through the checkpoint at Walter Reed, he reflected on how far he had come from his childhood in Washington's segregated neighborhoods. Growing up, Drew had witnessed firsthand the harsh realities of racial segregation in medicine. Black doctors were barred from most hospitals, forced to practice in underfunded facilities with outdated equipment. His father, a carpet layer, had worked multiple jobs to ensure Charles could attend Amherst College, where he excelled not only in academics but also in athletics, becoming a star athlete in multiple sports. Medical school at McGill University in Montreal had been a revelation. For the first time, Drew experienced an environment where his skills and intelligence were judged without the burden of racial prejudice. He graduated with top honors and developed his groundbreaking research on blood storage and transfusion. His doctoral thesis on banked blood would later become the foundation for blood banking systems used worldwide. When Drew arrived at Walter Reed, the normally bustling emergency entrance was surprisingly quiet. Colonel Matthews met him at the door, his expression grave. He was a tall, thin man with graying temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. "Dr. Drew, thank you for coming so quickly. Before we proceed, I need to brief you on the patient's condition." They walked through the hospital's polished corridors, past rooms filled with wounded soldiers recovering from battles across the Pacific and European theaters. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the underlying tension that permeated all military medical facilities during wartime. General Patterson was returning from a classified briefing when his driver lost control on a wet road. The vehicle rolled 3 times before coming to rest against a concrete barrier. The driver was killed instantly, but the general survived with what our initial examination suggests are severe internal injuries, possible spleen laceration, and significant blood loss. Drew nodded, already visualizing the surgical procedures that might be required. What's his current condition? Blood pressure? Consciousness level? Stable but critical. We've managed to control the external bleeding, but he's lost a significant amount of blood. We've typed him as O-negative, which, as you know, makes transfusion more complicated. They reached the surgical wing, where Drew could see increased activity. Nurses moved efficiently between rooms, and the usual calm of the hospital had been replaced with the focused intensity that accompanied high-profile emergency cases. "There's something else. Dr. Drew?" Colonel Matthews said, stopping outside the surgical preparation room. General Patterson specifically requested that only white medical personnel be involved in his treatment. The words hit Drew like a physical blow, though he managed to maintain his professional composure. He had encountered such requests before, but never in a situation where his expertise was simultaneously desperately needed and unwanted. "I see," Drew replied quietly. "In that case, I assume you'll want me to consult with your surgical team and provide guidance rather than perform the operation myself." Colonel Matthews looked uncomfortable. "That's where we have a problem, Dr. Drew. Our lead surgeon, Dr. Morrison, attempted the initial surgery 2 hours ago. He encountered complications beyond his experience level and had to close without completing the procedure. Dr. Williams, our second-best surgeon, reviewed the case and believes the operation requires techniques that, frankly, only you have mastered." Drew understood the impossible situation they faced. The general needed surgery that only Drew could perform, but the general's racial prejudices prevented him from accepting treatment from a black surgeon. It was a stark reminder of the contradictions that defined American society, even as the nation fought a war ostensibly about freedom and human dignity. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Colonel?" "We need you to save his life, Dr. Drew. The general is unconscious now due to sedation, and Dr. Morrison believes he has perhaps 6 to 8 hours before his condition becomes irreversible. We're asking you to perform the surgery despite his stated preferences." Drew walked to the window overlooking the hospital's courtyard. Below, he could see ambulances arriving with more wounded soldiers, young men who had given everything for their country. The irony wasn't lost on him that his blood plasma innovations had saved many of these same soldiers, regardless of their race or background, yet the general would refuse his direct medical intervention based solely on the color of his skin. "I need to examine the patient first," Drew said finally. "I won't make any decisions about treatment until I understand exactly what we're dealing with." Colonel Matthews led him to the intensive care unit where General Patterson lay unconscious. Even in his sedated state, the general's bearing suggested a man accustomed to command. He was in his early 50s, with graying hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent considerable time in combat zones. Multiple IV lines delivered fluids and medications, while monitors tracked his vital signs. Drew reviewed the medical charts and X-rays, his trained eye immediately identifying the complexities that had overwhelmed the previous surgical team. The general had suffered a grade 4 splenic laceration, which was bleeding internally despite the previous surgical intervention. More concerning was evidence of damage to the portal vein, a complication that required extremely precise surgical technique to repair successfully. Morrison did competent work, Drew observed, but this type of vascular repair requires experience with techniques that most surgeons simply haven't had occasion to develop. Without proper repair of the portal vein, the general will experience liver failure within hours. He continued his examination, noting signs that the general's condition was deteriorating more rapidly than the earlier estimates suggested. The combination of blood loss and the stress of the previous failed surgery had weakened him significantly. "Colonel, I need you to understand something clearly. This surgery requires absolute precision and cannot be interrupted once it begins. The portal vein repair alone will take at least 2 hours, during which any distraction or disruption could be fatal. If the general regains consciousness during the procedure and objects to my presence, we could lose him on the table." Colonel Matthews nodded grimly. "We understand the risks, Dr. Drew. The question is, are you willing to proceed despite the general's stated preferences?" Drew looked again at the unconscious general, then at the monitors showing his gradually declining vital signs. This was a moment that would define not only the general's fate, but also Drew's own legacy. He could walk away, letting others deal with the consequences of prejudice meeting medical necessity. Or he could do what he had sworn to do as a physician, save lives regardless of personal cost. I need two things, Colonel. First, I want a written order from your commanding officer authorizing this surgery, despite the general's preferences. Second, I need your assurance that once I begin the operation, no one enters that surgical suite until it's completed, regardless of what anyone might say or demand. You have both guarantees, Doctor. Drew nodded slowly. Then let's prepare for surgery. And, Colonel, I hope you understand that what happens tonight will likely have consequences far beyond this hospital. As Drew began his surgical preparations, he reflected on the strange turn his career had taken. He had begun his medical training hoping to heal people and advance medical science. Instead, he found himself constantly navigating the treacherous waters of racial prejudice, even as his innovations saved lives on a massive scale. His work with blood plasma had begun during his residency, when he became fascinated by the challenges of blood storage and transfusion. Traditional methods resulted in rapid deterioration of stored blood, making it difficult to maintain adequate supplies for emergency situations. Drew's research had focused on separating plasma from whole blood, creating a product that could be stored much longer while retaining its life-saving properties. The breakthrough had come during his fellowship in New York, where he developed techniques for processing and preserving plasma that extended its shelf life from days to months. When the war began, Drew's methods became crucial for treating wounded soldiers, particularly in remote locations where fresh blood wasn't available. Ironically, Drew's innovations had made him indispensable to the war effort, while simultaneously highlighting the absurdity of racial segregation in medicine. His plasma saved lives without regard to the race of donor or recipient. Yet military policy initially required segregation of blood supplies by race, a scientifically baseless practice that Drew had fought against throughout his career. As he scrubbed in for surgery, Drew was joined by his usual surgical team from Freedman's Hospital. Colonel Matthews had quietly arranged for them to assist, understanding that Drew worked best with nurses and technicians who knew his methods intimately. The team had worked together on hundreds of complex surgeries, developing the kind of seamless coordination that made difficult operations possible. "Dr. Drew," said Sarah Williams, his head surgical nurse, "we've prepared the operating theater according to your specifications. Blood plasma supplies are ready, and we have O-negative blood standing by if transfusion becomes necessary." Drew appreciated Sarah's calm professionalism. She was one of the most skilled surgical nurses he had ever worked with, despite being relegated to working at a segregated hospital because of her race. Her presence tonight would be crucial for the surgery's success, yet he knew that if the general were conscious, he would likely object to her involvement as well. The surgical theater at Walter Reed was impressively equipped, with the latest lighting and monitoring equipment that most civilian hospitals could only dream of. Drew adjusted the overhead lights and positioned himself at the operating table, looking down at the patient who would never have chosen him as a surgeon, but whose life now depended entirely on his skills. "Vitals are stable," reported Dr. James Thompson, the anesthesiologist Drew had worked with for years. "Blood pressure is holding at 110/70, but I can see signs that we're fighting against ongoing internal bleeding." Drew made his first incision, immediately noting the evidence of the previous surgical intervention. Dr. Morrison had done adequate work given his limitations, but the portal vein repair had been beyond his capabilities. Drew could see where Morrison had attempted to control the bleeding, but had been forced to place temporary clamps rather than make permanent repairs. "Sarah, I need better visualization here. Can you adjust the retractors?" As Drew worked, he found himself thinking about the broader implications of this moment. Here was a general who had dedicated his career to fighting fascism in Europe. Yet he carried his own prejudices that reflected the very ideologies America was fighting against. The contradiction was stark and troubling. The surgery progressed methodically, with Drew carefully repairing the damaged spleen and addressing the more complex portal vein injury. His hands moved with the confidence that came from years of experience, each movement precise and economical. Around him, his surgical team anticipated his needs with the efficiency that made complex operations possible. "Portal vein repair is complete," Drew announced after nearly 2 hours of delicate work. Bleeding has stopped and blood flow appears normal. Let's check the spleen repair and make sure we haven't missed anything. As he completed the final sutures, Drew felt the satisfaction that came with a successful complex surgery. The general would live, and more importantly, would recover fully if there were no complications during recovery. The technical challenges had been significant, but Drew's experience had made the difference between life and death. Surgery complete. Let's monitor closely for the next few hours, but I expect full recovery. As the surgical team began the process of closing and preparing the patient for recovery, Drew reflected on what had just occurred. He had saved the life of a man who would have refused his treatment based purely on racial prejudice. The general would wake up owing his life to the very people his beliefs had rejected. Colonel Matthews met Drew outside the surgical suite, his relief evident in his expression. "How did it go, Doctor?" "Drew?" "Successful. The general should make a full recovery, though he'll need careful monitoring over the next 48 hours. The portal vein repair was more complex than initially indicated, but we were able to restore normal function. Drew, I want you to know that what you did tonight won't be forgotten. There are many people in this hospital who understand the significance of your actions." Drew nodded thoughtfully. "Colonel, I did what any physician would do when faced with a patient in need. The general's personal beliefs don't change my oath to preserve life." As Drew prepared to leave Walter Reed and return to his own hospital, he knew that the most challenging part of this situation was yet to come. When General Patterson regained consciousness and learned who had performed his surgery, the reaction would likely be significant. But for tonight, Drew was satisfied knowing that he had honored his commitment to medicine above all other considerations. The drive back to Friedman's hospital gave Drew time to process the evening's events. He had grown accustomed to the contradictions of practicing medicine in a segregated society, but tonight had crystallized the absurdity of the situation in ways that were particularly stark. His expertise was acknowledged when convenient, but rejected when prejudice overruled medical necessity. Yet Drew also felt a sense of hope. The young doctors and nurses at Walter Reed who had witnessed tonight's surgery would remember that competence and dedication transcended racial boundaries. Perhaps some of them would carry that lesson into their own careers, gradually changing the medical profession from within. As he pulled into the parking lot at Friedman's hospital, Drew saw the lights still burning in the emergency ward. There would be more patients, more surgeries, more opportunities to practice the medicine he loved, despite the obstacles society placed in his path. Tonight had been unusual in its dramatic nature, but the underlying challenges were ones he faced every day. Drew knew that word of tonight's surgery would spread quickly through Washington's medical community. Some would praise his skill and dedication. Others would criticize his willingness to operate on an unwilling patient. But Drew had made his choice based on the principles that had guided his entire career: medical excellence in service of preserving human life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he had saved a life, and perhaps in some small way advanced the cause of equality in American medicine. For a man who had dedicated his career to fighting both disease and discrimination, it had been a successful evening indeed. General William Patterson's eyes opened slowly, the fog of anesthesia gradually lifting as consciousness returned. The first sensation was pain, a deep aching in his abdomen that reminded him immediately of the accident. The second was confusion about where he was and what had happened to him. "General Patterson, can you hear me?" The voice belonged to Colonel Matthews, who had been waiting at the bedside for nearly 3 hours, anticipating this moment with considerable anxiety. Patterson tried to speak, but found his throat dry and scratchy. A nurse immediately offered him ice chips, which he accepted gratefully. As his vision cleared, he could see that he was in a private room at Walter Reed, connected to various monitoring devices and IV lines. "The accident," Patterson managed to croak. "Sergeant Murphy?" Colonel Matthews's expression grew somber. "I'm sorry, General. Sergeant Murphy didn't survive. He was killed instantly when the jeep rolled." Patterson closed his eyes, absorbing the news. Murphy had been his driver for 2 years, a young man from Ohio who had volunteered for military service despite having a wife and newborn daughter at home. The weight of responsibility for his death settled heavily on Patterson's chest. "The surgery," Patterson said, his mind beginning to clear. "How long was I unconscious?" This was the moment Colonel Matthews had been dreading. He had spent hours considering how to deliver the news, knowing that Patterson's reaction could have serious implications for everyone involved. "General, you underwent emergency surgery last night. The operation was successful, and Dr. Morrison expects you to make a full recovery." Patterson nodded slowly, accepting the information without questioning the details. He had always trusted the medical staff at Walter Reed and assumed that his care had been handled by the usual team of military surgeons. "I want to thank Dr. Morrison and his team," Patterson said. "From what I remember of the accident, the injuries were quite severe." Colonel Matthews felt his stomach tighten. "General, there's something important I need to discuss with you about your surgery, Dr. Burke." Morrison began the operation, but he encountered complications that were beyond his expertise. The damage to your portal vein required surgical techniques that very few doctors have mastered. Patterson's expression became more alert, sensing that there was more to this story than the colonel was initially revealing. "Are you telling me that Dr. Morrison wasn't able to complete the surgery?" "That's correct, General. Dr. Morrison had to call in a specialist, someone with extensive experience in vascular surgery and complex abdominal procedures." "Who?" Patterson asked, though something in the colonel's demeanor suggested that the answer would not be welcome. Colonel Matthews took a deep breath. "Dr. Charles Drew from Freedman's Hospital performed the surgery that saved your life, General." The silence that followed was profound. Patterson stared at the colonel for what seemed like minutes, processing information that contradicted everything he had believed about his medical care. His face cycled through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and finally a growing anger that seemed to emanate from deep within him. "You're telling me," Patterson said slowly, his voice gaining strength, "that a Negro surgeon operated on me after I specifically requested that only white medical personnel be involved in my treatment? General, your condition was critical. Dr. Penn, Drew was the only surgeon available who possessed the skills necessary to save your life." Morrison and Dr. Williams both agreed that without Dr. Persith, Drew's intervention, you would not have survived the night. Patterson attempted to sit up, ignoring the pain that shot through his abdomen. "Colonel, I don't care about my condition. I specifically stated my preferences regarding medical treatment, and you chose to ignore those preferences without my consent. Sir, you were unconscious and facing imminent death. We made the decision that preserving your life took precedence over other considerations." The general's anger was now fully evident, his face flushed despite his weakened condition. "That decision was not yours to make, Colonel. I would rather have died than receive treatment that violated my principles." Colonel Matthews had anticipated this reaction, but was still struck by the vehemence of Patterson's response. Here was a man who had just been saved by one of the most skilled surgeons in the country. Yet his primary concern was not gratitude but outrage at the race of his savior. "General, with respect, Dr. Drew is widely recognized as one of the finest surgeons in the United States. His innovations in blood storage and plasma transfusion have saved thousands of Allied soldiers' lives. The surgery he performed on you was technically brilliant and executed flawlessly." "I don't care about his technical abilities," Patterson snapped. "The issue is not his competence, but the fact that my explicit instructions were disregarded. This is about respect for my rights as a patient and as an officer." The argument was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Ferretti, Morrison, who had come to check on his patient's recovery. Morrison was a competent military surgeon who had served with distinction, but he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. "General Patterson, it's good to see you awake and alert. How are you feeling?" "Dr. Jan." "Morrison, I understand you began my surgery but were unable to complete it." Morrison looked uncomfortable, glancing between Patterson and Colonel Matthews. "That's correct, General. The vascular damage was more extensive than our initial examination indicated. The portal vein repair required techniques that are outside my area of expertise. And you called in Dr. Drew without consulting me or waiting for me to regain consciousness." "General, there wasn't time for consultation. You were losing blood faster than we could replace it, and delay would have been fatal. Drew's intervention saved your life." Patterson's expression remained hard. "Morrison, I appreciate your efforts and understand the medical emergency. However, I want it clearly understood that I consider this a violation of my rights as a patient. I will be filing formal complaints about this incident. Dr. Morrison was taken aback by the general's response. In his years of military medicine, he had never encountered a patient who was angry about receiving life-saving treatment from a highly qualified physician. General, I hope you'll reconsider that position. Dr. Dr. Drew performed surgery that, frankly, few surgeons in the world could have accomplished. You're alive today because of his skill and dedication. That may be true, Dr. Morrison, but it doesn't change the fundamental issue. My preferences were known and were deliberately ignored. As news of the general's reaction spread through Walter Reed, it created a complex and uncomfortable situation for everyone involved. The medical staff found themselves divided between those who supported the decision to use Dr. Drew and those who believed patient preferences should have been respected regardless of the consequences. Dr. Sarah Williams, Drew's surgical nurse, was particularly affected by the general's response. She had worked through the night to ensure the surgery's success, using skills that had been developed over years of training and experience. To learn that the patient was angry rather than grateful felt like a personal affront to her professionalism. I've never seen anything like it, she confided to Dr. Thompson, the anesthesiologist who had also participated in the surgery. We saved his life and he's angry about it. What kind of world are we living in where a patient's prejudice is considered more important than his survival? Dr. Pink said. Thompson, who was white, found himself wrestling with his own feelings about the situation. He had worked with Dr. Drew for years and had enormous respect for his abilities, but he also understood the social realities that made situations like this possible. Sarah, I think the general's reaction says more about the society we live in than it does about any individual. The man has been taught his entire life that racial separation is not just acceptable but necessary. It's hard to change those beliefs even when confronted with evidence of their absurdity. Meanwhile, word of the incident was beginning to spread beyond Walter Reed. The Washington medical community was small and tightly connected, and news of such a dramatic situation traveled quickly. Dr. Drew arrived at his office at Freedman's Hospital to find several messages from colleagues asking for his perspective on what had occurred. Drew had expected some controversy, but was still disappointed by the intensity of the general's reaction. He had hoped that the successful surgery might create an opportunity for dialogue about the capabilities of black medical professionals, but instead it seemed to have reinforced existing prejudices. Dr. Drew, said his secretary, there's a reporter from the Washington Post waiting to speak with you about last night's surgery at Walter Reed. Drew sighed, realizing that the situation was about to become much more public than he had anticipated. He had always tried to let his work speak for itself rather than engage in public debates about racial issues, but this situation seemed to be forcing him into a more prominent role. Send him in, Drew said. I suppose this conversation was inevitable. The reporter, James Mitchell, was a middle-aged white man who covered medical and scientific developments for the Post. He had heard about the incident through sources at Walter Reed and recognized it as a story with significant implications. Dr. Drew, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. Can you confirm that you performed emergency surgery on General Patterson at Walter Reed last night? Drew chose his words carefully. I can confirm that I was called to Walter Reed to consult on a case involving complex vascular surgery. Patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing specific details of any individual's medical treatment. Dr. Drew, sources at the hospital indicate that the patient had specifically requested that only white medical personnel be involved in his treatment. Can you comment on the ethical implications of operating on a patient against his stated preferences? This was the question Drew had been anticipating and dreading. His response would likely be quoted widely and could influence public opinion about the broader issues of race and medicine. Mr. Mitchell, when a physician is faced with a patient whose life is in immediate danger, the primary obligation is to preserve that life using the best medical care available. Personal preferences, while important, cannot take precedence over the fundamental duty to prevent death when it can be prevented. But don't patients have the right to choose their medical providers even if those choices are based on racial prejudice? Drew paused, considering how to answer without appearing to minimize the importance of patient rights while still defending the principle that medical care should be provided based on competence rather than race. Patients certainly have rights regarding their medical care, but those rights must be balanced against other considerations. If a patient's preferences would result in their death, When competent medical care is available, I believe physicians have an obligation to preserve life first and address other concerns afterward. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, with Mitchell asking detailed questions about Drew's background, his innovations in blood storage, and his views on segregation in medicine. Drew answered thoughtfully, trying to maintain a professional tone while making his position clear. After the reporter left, Drew sat alone in his office contemplating the likely consequences of the night's events. He had saved a life, which should have been a source of satisfaction, but instead, he felt troubled by the broader implications of the situation. His secretary knocked on the door. "Dr. Drew, Colonel Matthews from Walter Reed is on the phone. He says it's urgent." Drew picked up the phone expecting to hear about complications with the general's recovery. "Dr. Drew, I'm calling to inform you that General Patterson has filed formal complaints with both the Military Medical Command and the American Medical Association regarding last night's surgery. He's alleging that his rights as a patient were violated when you operated without his consent." Drew absorbed this information without surprise, but with considerable disappointment. "Colonel, what specific charges is he filing?" "He's claiming medical assault, violation of patient rights, and professional misconduct. He's also demanding that the military review its policies regarding patient preferences and physician assignments." "I see. And what is the hospital's position regarding these complaints?" Colonel Matthews hesitated before answering. Drew, the hospital administration is divided. Some officials support the decision to use your services and consider the surgery a medical success. Others are concerned about the precedent this sets regarding patient autonomy and are worried about the political implications of the situation. Drew understood the delicate position Walter Reed found itself in. Supporting him meant potentially alienating powerful military officers who shared Patterson's views, while condemning him meant implicitly accepting that racial prejudice should determine medical treatment decisions. "Colonel, I want you to know that I stand behind my decision to perform that surgery. Given the same circumstances, I would make the same choice again. Patient preferences are important, but they cannot supersede the fundamental obligation to preserve life when medically possible. Dr. Drew, I personally agree with your position, but I wanted you to be aware that this situation is likely to become quite public and potentially contentious." After ending the call, Drew walked to his window overlooking the street below. He could see patients arriving at Friedman's hospital, many of whom had been turned away from white hospitals because of their race. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. He was being criticized for treating a white patient who didn't want his care, while thousands of black patients were denied care at white hospitals every day. That afternoon, Drew received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Charles Houston, a prominent civil rights lawyer who had been instrumental in challenging segregation in education, came to discuss the legal implications of the Patterson case. "Charles," Houston said, using Drew's first name as they had been friends since college, "this incident could become a landmark case in challenging medical segregation. If we handle it correctly, it could force a broader examination of racial discrimination in healthcare." Drew listened thoughtfully as Houston outlined potential legal strategies, but he felt reluctant to become the center of a major civil rights case. "Charles, my primary goal has always been to practice medicine and advance medical science. I'm not sure I want to become a symbol in a broader political fight. But Charles, you already are a symbol. Your work with blood plasma has made you one of the most prominent black physicians in the country. Whether you choose it or not, your actions carry weight in the fight for equality." As the day progressed, Drew found himself fielding calls from medical colleagues, civil rights organizations, and journalists, all seeking his perspective on the incident. Each conversation reinforced his growing realization that the surgery at Walter Reed had transformed him from a respected physician into a central figure in a national debate about race and medicine. The complexity of the situation was evident in the variety of responses he received. Some colleagues praised his decision to prioritize medical need over patient prejudice, while others questioned whether he had overstepped professional boundaries. Civil rights leaders saw an opportunity to challenge segregation in healthcare, while some medical professionals worried about the precedent of disregarding patient preferences. By evening, Drew was exhausted by the attention and controversy surrounding what he had considered a straightforward medical decision. As he prepared to leave his office, His secretary informed him that General Patterson had given an interview to the Washington Evening Star and that the article would be published in the next day's edition. Drew realized that the battle over his actions was just beginning, and that the ultimate resolution would likely have implications far beyond one night's surgery at Walter Reed. The general's recovery was medically successful, but the social and professional consequences of that success were only beginning to unfold. That night, as Drew sat in his study at home reviewing medical journals, he reflected on the strange turn his career had taken. He had entered medicine to heal people and advance scientific knowledge, but found himself repeatedly confronting the social and political barriers that limited opportunities for black professionals. The phone rang again, interrupting his thoughts. This time it was Dr. Montague Cobb, a prominent black physician and civil rights activist from Howard University. "Charles, I've been following the developments regarding your surgery at Walter Reed. This situation presents both opportunities and dangers for all of us in the medical profession." Drew listened as Cobb outlined his concerns about the potential backlash from the white medical establishment and the need to present a unified response that emphasized professional competence over racial politics. "Montague, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not sure I want this incident to become a cause célèbre. I would prefer to let my work speak for itself. Charles, I understand your reluctance, but the reality is that this situation is bigger than your individual preferences. The way this case is resolved will influence the opportunities available to every black physician in the country." As the conversation ended, Drew realized that he was at a crossroads in his career. He could attempt to minimize the controversy and return to his previous role as a respected but relatively quiet medical professional. Or he could embrace the opportunity to advocate for broader changes in American medicine. The decision would define not only his own future, but also his contribution to the long struggle for equality in American healthcare. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to advance both medical science and social justice, but tonight he could only prepare for whatever lay ahead. The morning newspaper headlines were everything Dr. Drew had feared and more. The Washington Post's front page carried the story with a banner headline, "Negro Surgeon Operates on General Against Patient's Will." The Washington Evening Star was even more sensational. "Military Patient Outraged by Forced Treatment from Colored Doctor." Drew sat in his kitchen, reading the articles with a growing sense of unease. The stories portrayed the incident in starkly different ways depending on the newspaper's editorial stance. But all of them missed the fundamental medical reality that had driven his decision. The focus was entirely on the racial controversy rather than the life-saving surgery that had made the controversy possible. The Post's article was relatively balanced, presenting both sides of the ethical debate and including quotes from medical ethicists about patient autonomy versus physician duty. However, the Evening Star's coverage was clearly sympathetic to General Patterson's position, describing Drew's actions as medical assault and questioning whether racial activists were using the medical profession to advance their political agenda. Most troubling to Drew was the way both newspapers characterized the incident as a deliberate confrontation rather than an emergency medical situation. The articles implied that Drew had sought out the opportunity to operate on an unwilling white patient, completely ignoring the fact that he had been called to Walter Reed specifically because of his unique qualifications. The phone began ringing before Drew had finished his morning coffee. The first call was from his department chair at Howard University Medical School, where Drew served as a professor of surgery. "Charles, I've just read the morning papers. This situation has the potential to create significant problems for our medical school and for black physicians generally. We need to discuss how to handle the publicity and potential backlash." Drew understood the concern. Howard University Medical School was one of the few institutions in the country that trained black physicians, and any controversy that reflected negatively on its faculty could have serious consequences for current students and future applicants. Dr. Johnson, I want to emphasize that my actions were purely medical in nature. I was not trying to make a political statement, but simply responding to a medical emergency with the skills I possess. I believe that, Charles, but the public perception is quite different. We're already receiving calls from donors and board members expressing concern about the university's association with this controversy. The conversation continued for 30 minutes, with Dr. Johnson outlining the various pressures the university was facing and the need for a coordinated response that would protect both Drew's reputation and the institution's standing in the medical community. The second call was from Dr. Drew's wife, Lenore, who was at her teaching position at an elementary school in Washington. "Charles, the children are asking me about the newspaper stories they've heard their parents discussing. Some of them are confused about why people are angry at you for saving someone's life." This was perhaps the most painful aspect of the situation for Drew. His 4 children would inevitably be affected by the controversy, and he worried about how the publicity might impact their daily lives and their understanding of their father's work. "Lenore, please tell the children that their father did what he thought was right based on his training as a doctor. Sometimes adults disagree about complicated issues, but that doesn't change the fact that helping sick people is always the right thing to do." Throughout the morning, the calls continued to pour in. Journalists from newspapers across the country wanted Drew's perspective on the incident and its broader implications. Medical colleagues from both black and white institutions called to express either support or concern about his actions. Civil rights organizations wanted to use the incident to highlight discrimination in healthcare, while some medical associations worried about the precedent of disregarding patient preferences. One particularly challenging call came from Dr. William Montague, the chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, where Drew had done some of his training. Montague was widely respected in the medical community and had been one of Drew's mentors during his early career. "Charles, I'm calling because I'm deeply concerned about the direction this controversy is taking. While I have enormous respect for your surgical skills, I think you may have overstepped professional boundaries by operating on an unwilling patient." Drew felt a stab of disappointment at hearing criticism from someone he had long admired. "Dr. Montague, the patient was unconscious and facing imminent death. The choice was between performing surgery without explicit consent or allowing him to die when his life could be saved. But, Charles, patient autonomy is a fundamental principle of medical ethics. If we start making exceptions based on our personal judgment about what's best for patients, we undermine the entire foundation of the doctor-patient relationship." The conversation highlighted the complex ethical terrain Drew was navigating. The medical community was genuinely divided about whether his actions had been appropriate, regardless of their views on racial issues. Some physicians saw his decision as a clear example of putting medical necessity ahead of other considerations, while others viewed it as a dangerous precedent that could erode patient rights. By midday, the story had been picked up by national news services and was appearing in newspapers across the country. Drew's secretary informed him that reporters from Time magazine and Newsweek had called requesting interviews, and that several radio stations wanted him to appear on talk shows to discuss the incident. The national attention brought both support and criticism from unexpected quarters. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People issued a statement praising Drew's actions and calling for an end to segregation in healthcare. The American Medical Association, however, announced that it would be reviewing the incident to determine whether any ethical violations had occurred. Most surprisingly, Drew received a telegram of support from Dr. Alexander Fleming, the British physician who had discovered penicillin. Fleming wrote that he had followed Drew's work in blood banking and considered him one of the most important medical researchers of his generation, regardless of the current controversy. However, the negative responses were equally intense. Several medical organizations in the South issued statements condemning Drew's actions and calling for stricter enforcement of racial separation in healthcare. Some military officers wrote letters to newspapers arguing that Drew's behavior demonstrated why integration of medical facilities would be dangerous to patient welfare. The controversy took a particularly ugly turn when Drew received several threatening phone calls and letters. The messages were filled with racial slurs and threats of violence, forcing Drew to consider whether his family's safety might be at risk. "Dr. Drew," his secretary said nervously, "there's been a man sitting in a car outside the hospital for the past 2 hours. He keeps asking questions about your schedule and when you usually leave the building." Drew realized that the situation had escalated beyond a professional disagreement into something potentially dangerous. He contacted the hospital security and asked them to monitor the situation and ensure that his family was protected. That afternoon brought an unexpected development. Colonel Matthews called to inform Drew that General Patterson had requested a meeting with him. "Drew, the general wants to speak with you personally about the incident." He's insisted that the meeting be private, with no other medical staff or administrators present. Drew was intrigued but cautious about the request. He wasn't sure what Patterson hoped to accomplish with such a meeting, and he was concerned that it might be an attempt to pressure him into making some kind of public apology. "Colonel, what exactly does the general want to discuss?" "He hasn't specified, Dr. Drew. He simply said that he believes a face-to-face conversation is necessary before this situation progresses further." Drew agreed to the meeting, partly out of curiosity and partly from a hope that direct dialogue might help resolve some of the misunderstandings surrounding the incident. They arranged to meet that evening in Patterson's hospital room, with only a nurse present for medical monitoring. When Drew entered the room, he found General Patterson sitting up in bed, looking considerably stronger than he had the previous day. The general's expression was serious but not hostile, suggesting that his attitude might have evolved somewhat since his initial angry reaction. "Dr. Drew, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Please, have a seat." Drew pulled up a chair beside the bed, uncertain about what to expect from the conversation. "Dr. Drew, I want to begin by acknowledging that your surgery was technically excellent and that you undoubtedly saved my life. From a purely medical standpoint, I owe you an enormous debt of gratitude." This was not what Drew had anticipated hearing from the general, and he listened carefully to see where the conversation was leading. However, Patterson continued, "I also want you to understand why I reacted so strongly to learning about your involvement in my treatment. It wasn't personal animosity toward you as an individual, but rather my belief that certain principles about medical treatment should be respected regardless of the circumstances." Drew nodded, appreciating the general's attempt to explain his position without resorting to the inflammatory language that had characterized much of the public discussion. "General, I understand that you feel your wishes were disregarded, and I can appreciate why that would be troubling. However, I hope you can also understand that as a physician, I was faced with a choice between respecting your preferences and preserving your life. In that situation, my medical training dictated that saving your life had to take priority." Patterson was quiet for several moments, seeming to weigh Drew's words carefully. "Dr. Drew, can I ask you a direct question? If the situation had been reversed, if you had been the patient and had specifically requested treatment only from Negro physicians, would you have wanted your preferences honored even if it meant receiving substandard care?" The question caught Drew off guard, partly because it forced him to consider the situation from an entirely different perspective. "General, I would hope that I would want the best possible medical care regardless of the race of the physician providing it. However, I also recognize that people's beliefs and preferences are shaped by their experiences and backgrounds, and those feelings are real even when they might not be medically rational." "That's exactly my point, Dr. Drew. You operated on me based on your values and your understanding of what was medically appropriate. But you didn't consider whether your values should supersede my values, even in a life-threatening situation." Drew found himself engaged in the kind of philosophical discussion he had never expected to have with a patient, particularly one whose initial reaction had been so hostile. "General, may I ask you something? Now that you've had time to reflect on the situation, do you still believe you would have preferred to die rather than receive treatment from a skilled black physician?" Patterson paused for a long time before answering, and Drew could see that the question was forcing him to confront some difficult personal truths. "Dr. Drew, I honestly don't know how to answer that question. 3 days ago, I would have said yes without hesitation, but lying here alive today, knowing that I'm going to recover fully and return to my family and my duties, it's much harder to maintain that position." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with both men exploring the complex intersection of medical ethics, personal beliefs, and social conventions. Drew found himself impressed by Patterson's willingness to engage in serious discussion rather than simply defending his initial position. "Dr. Drew, I want you to know that I've decided to withdraw the formal complaints I filed regarding your treatment. After speaking with you directly and thinking more carefully about the situation, I've concluded that your actions were motivated by medical necessity rather than any desire to challenge my personal beliefs. This was an unexpected and significant development that would likely influence how the broader medical community viewed the incident. General, I appreciate that decision, and I hope you understand that my only motivation was to preserve your life using the best medical care available." "I do understand that now, Dr. Drew. However, I also want to be clear that this experience hasn't fundamentally changed my views about racial separation in other contexts. I still believe that segregation serves important social functions, even if medical emergencies might require temporary exceptions. Drew was disappointed but not surprised by this qualification. He had hoped that the incident might lead to broader reconsideration of racial attitudes, but he recognized that deeply held beliefs rarely changed as a result of single experiences. As the meeting concluded, both men seemed to feel that they had achieved a better understanding of each other's positions, even if they hadn't reached complete agreement on the underlying issues. Dr. Drew, I want to ask you a favor. Would you be willing to make a joint public statement with me about this incident? I think it would help calm some of the controversy and present a more balanced view of what actually occurred. Drew agreed to consider the proposal, recognizing that a joint statement might help reduce the inflammatory rhetoric that had characterized much of the public discussion. When Drew left Walter Reed that evening, he felt cautiously optimistic that the worst of the controversy might be behind him. The general's decision to withdraw his complaints would likely influence other critics and might allow the focus to shift from legal and ethical arguments back to the medical realities of the situation. However, Drew also realized that the broader issues raised by the incident would not disappear simply because one patient had changed his mind about pursuing formal complaints. The questions about race and medicine, patient autonomy, and physician duty would continue to challenge the medical community for years to come. The next morning brought news that the joint statement would indeed be released, and that several major newspapers had agreed to publish it prominently. Drew hoped that this development might mark the beginning of a more constructive discussion about the complex issues the incident had raised. As he prepared for another day of interviews and meetings, Drew reflected on how quickly his life had changed from routine medical practice to national controversy, and back towards something approaching normalcy. The experience had been exhausting and troubling, but it had also demonstrated that even in a deeply segregated society, medical competence could sometimes transcend racial boundaries. The phone rang again, interrupting his thoughts. This time it was a call that would take the story in yet another unexpected direction, one that would have implications far beyond the individual case that had started the controversy. The phone call that would change everything came from an unexpected source. Dr. Grady, Jonas Salk at the University of Pittsburgh. Salk was working on what would later become the polio vaccine, and his call to Drew was about something entirely different from the Walter Reed controversy. Dr. Drew, I've been following the coverage of your situation, and while I'm sorry you've had to endure such scrutiny, it's actually prompted me to reach out about a collaboration I've been considering. Drew was intrigued. He had followed Salk's research and respected his innovative approaches to vaccine development. Dr. Salk, I appreciate your call. What kind of collaboration were you thinking about? Dr. Drew, your work in blood banking and plasma storage has applications beyond trauma surgery. I believe your techniques could be crucial for vaccine distribution, particularly in developing countries where refrigeration and storage are major challenges. The conversation opened up possibilities that Drew had never considered. His innovations in blood preservation could potentially be adapted to maintain vaccine stability in difficult environmental conditions, dramatically expanding the reach of public health programs. That's fascinating, Dr. Salk. I hadn't thought about applying blood storage techniques to vaccine preservation, but the principles might indeed be similar. Exactly. And Dr. Drew, I want you to know that your recent controversy has actually reinforced my belief that we need to work with the best scientists available, regardless of other considerations. The research we're discussing could save thousands of lives worldwide. The call with Salk was energizing for Drew in a way that the recent publicity had not been. Here was an opportunity to contribute to medical advances that could have global impact, far beyond the racial divisions that had dominated recent discussions of his work. However, the positive developments were quickly overshadowed by news from Walter Reed. Colonel Matthews called with information that would complicate the situation significantly. Drew, we've discovered that there may have been other factors involved in General Patterson's accident that weren't initially apparent. Military investigators have found evidence that the Jeep's brakes had been tampered with. This revelation transformed the incident from a simple traffic accident into something potentially much more serious. If Patterson had been the target of sabotage, the medical treatment he received became even more critical, and the controversy over Drew's involvement took on new dimensions. Colonel, are you saying that someone deliberately tried to harm the general? That's what the investigation is suggesting. We're looking into several possibilities, including enemy agents, but we're also examining whether military personnel might have been involved. Drew realized that if Patterson had been the target of an assassination attempt, the successful surgery at Walter Reed had implications beyond the immediate medical situation. The general's survival might have prevented enemy agents from achieving their objective, making Drew's controversial decision to operate even more significant. The investigation into the accident coincided with General Patterson's release from Walter Reed. His recovery had been remarkably smooth, with no complications from the complex surgery Drew had performed. Medically, the case was a complete success, even as the social and political ramifications continued to unfold. On the day of Patterson's discharge, he made an unexpected request to speak privately with Drew one final time. When Drew arrived at the hospital, he found Patterson dressed in his military uniform, looking fully recovered and considerably different from the angry patient he had encountered days earlier. Dr. Drew, I wanted to speak with you before I leave the hospital. The investigators have confirmed that my accident was actually a deliberate attack by enemy agents who had infiltrated the Capitol. This confirmed what Drew had suspected since Colonel Matthews' phone call. General, I'm relieved to know that you've recovered completely and that the people responsible for the attack have been identified. Dr. Drew, that's what I wanted to discuss with you. If you hadn't performed that surgery, if you had honored my preferences and allowed me to die, those enemy agents would have succeeded in their mission. Your decision to prioritize medical necessity over my personal prejudices literally prevented an enemy victory. Drew hadn't considered the situation from this perspective, but he could see how Patterson's survival had broader implications for the war effort. General, I operated on you because you needed surgery to survive, not because I was thinking about military strategy or enemy agents. The medical necessity was reason enough for my decision. Patterson nodded slowly. I understand that, Dr. Drew, but the results go beyond what either of us anticipated. Your actions prevented what could have been a significant intelligence victory for our enemies. The conversation took on a more personal tone as Patterson struggled to reconcile his previous beliefs with the reality of what had occurred. Dr. Drew, I want to be honest with you about something. I was raised to believe that racial separation was natural and necessary, and those beliefs shaped my reaction to learning about your involvement in my treatment. But this experience has forced me to question some of those assumptions. Drew listened carefully, hoping that Patterson's comments represented genuine reflection rather than simply gratitude for medical care. General, beliefs that we learn early in life are often the hardest to change, even when experience suggests they might be inaccurate. That's exactly what I'm struggling with, Dr. Drew. My training and background told me that racial mixing in medicine was dangerous and inappropriate, but your competence and professionalism demonstrated that those beliefs weren't based on reality. Patterson paused, seeming to wrestle with ideas that challenged fundamental aspects of his worldview. Dr. Drew, I want to ask you to consider something. Would you be willing to work with me to address some of the racial barriers in military medicine? I think my experience could help other military officers understand that competence should be the primary criterion for medical personnel. This was an extraordinary request from someone who had initially been outraged by Drew's involvement in his care. Drew was both intrigued and cautious about the potential for such collaboration. General, I would certainly be interested in discussions about improving medical care for all military personnel. However, I would want to ensure that any changes were based on medical principles rather than political considerations. I understand your concern, Dr. Brandt. Drew, what I'm suggesting is that we focus on medical competence and patient outcomes rather than the racial politics that have dominated recent discussions. The conversation continued for another hour, with Patterson outlining his vision for gradual integration of military medical facilities based on demonstrated competence rather than racial quotas or political pressure. Drew found the general's ideas surprisingly sophisticated and potentially practical. As their meeting concluded, Patterson made one final request. Dr. Preferky, Drew, I'm going to be testifying before a congressional committee about military medical practices next month. Would you be willing to testify alongside me about the medical aspects of this incident and their implications for military healthcare policy? Drew agreed to consider the invitation, recognizing that congressional testimony would provide a platform to discuss medical integration based on professional competence rather than civil rights activism. The following week brought several unexpected developments that demonstrated the far-reaching impact of the Walter Reed incident. The first was a letter from Dr. William Mayo of the Mayo Clinic, inviting Drew to present his blood banking research at the clinic's annual medical conference. Dr. Drew, Mayo wrote, "Your recent publicity has reminded many of us in the medical community of your groundbreaking research in blood storage and preservation. We believe that your techniques deserve wider recognition and implementation in civilian hospitals." This invitation was significant because the Mayo Clinic was one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the country, and an invitation to present research there was a mark of professional recognition that transcended racial boundaries. The second development was a call from Dr. Ralph Bunche, who was working with the United Nations on international health initiatives. Bunche had heard about Salk's interest in adapting Drew's techniques for vaccine storage and wanted to explore applications for global health programs. "Dr. Drew, the techniques you've developed for blood storage could revolutionize vaccine distribution in tropical countries, where heat and humidity make preservation extremely difficult. We're looking at programs that could reach millions of people who currently have no access to vaccination." These international opportunities represented the kind of medical work Drew had always envisioned for his career, using scientific innovation to address major health challenges, regardless of political or racial considerations. However, the positive developments were balanced by continued controversy in some quarters. Several medical organizations in the South issued statements criticizing Drew's actions and arguing that patient preferences should always be respected, regardless of medical consequences. More troubling were reports that some hospitals were implementing new policies specifically designed to prevent situations like the Walter Reed incident. These policies required explicit written consent from patients before physicians of different races could provide treatment, potentially delaying emergency care in critical situations. Drew was particularly disturbed by a report from New Orleans, where a black physician had been prevented from treating a white child with appendicitis because the parents refused to consent to treatment by a Negro doctor. The child had died while waiting for a white surgeon to become available. "This is exactly what I was afraid would happen," Drew confided to his wife. Instead of leading to more rational policies about medical care, the publicity from the Patterson case might actually be making racial separation more rigid in some places. Lenore Drew had watched her husband struggle with the implications of his actions and the various responses they had generated. She understood both his satisfaction at having saved a life and his frustration at being forced into a role as a racial symbol when his primary identity was as a physician and researcher. "Charles, you did what you believed was medically necessary, and you saved a man's life. You can't control how other people choose to interpret or misuse that example." Drew knew his wife was right, but he still felt responsible for any negative consequences that might result from the publicity surrounding his actions. The situation took another unexpected turn when Drew received a call from President Truman's office. The president wanted to meet with Drew to discuss the broader implications of the Walter Reed incident for military medical policy and racial integration in federal institutions. "Drew, the president has been following your situation with considerable interest. He believes that your experience raises important questions about how federal institutions should balance individual preferences with institutional effectiveness." The invitation to meet with the president represented an extraordinary opportunity to influence national policy, but it also meant that Drew would be even more prominently associated with civil rights issues rather than medical research. As Drew prepared for the meeting with President Truman, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few weeks. What had begun as a routine emergency surgery had evolved into a national discussion about race, medicine, and patient rights. The ultimate consequences were still unclear, but Drew was beginning to understand that his actions at Walter Reed would likely influence American medicine for years to come. The meeting with President Truman was scheduled for the following week, and Drew spent considerable time preparing for discussions that could shape federal policy on racial integration in healthcare. He was determined to focus on medical competence and patient outcomes rather than abstract principles of civil rights, hoping to find practical solutions that would improve healthcare for all Americans. As he reviewed his notes for the meeting, Drew received one more call that would add yet another dimension to the situation. This time, it was from a source he had never expected to hear from, and the information would reveal aspects of the Walter Reed incident that had remained hidden until now. The call came from Mrs. Patricia Murphy, the widow of Sergeant Murphy who had died in the Jeep crash with General Patterson. Her voice was steady but emotional as she explained why she was reaching out to Drew. "Dr. Drew, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. I got your number from Colonel Matthews at Walter Reed. I wanted to thank you for saving General Patterson's life." Drew was puzzled by the call. He had expected that the sergeant's widow might blame him for focusing on Patterson while her husband had died, not express gratitude for his actions. "Mrs. Murphy, I'm very sorry for your loss. Your husband was a brave soldier who gave his life in service to his country." "Dr. Drew, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. General Patterson came to see me yesterday, and he told me something that I think you should know." Drew listened carefully as Mrs. Murphy explained that Patterson had visited her to personally express his condolences and to share information about the circumstances of the accident that had not been made public. Dr. Pete said, "Drew, the general told me that the enemy agents who sabotaged his Jeep were targeting him because of intelligence he was carrying about Allied invasion plans. If he had died from his injuries, those plans might have been compromised, and thousands of Allied soldiers could have been killed or captured." This revelation added yet another dimension to the implications of Drew's surgery. Not only had he saved Patterson's life, but he had potentially prevented a major intelligence disaster that could have affected the entire war effort. "Mrs. Murphy, I had no idea about the broader implications when I performed the surgery. I was simply trying to save a patient's life. I understand that, Dr. Drew, but I wanted you to know that by saving the general, you might have saved the lives of many other soldiers, including men who served alongside my husband. That makes his death feel like it served a larger purpose." The conversation with Mrs. Murphy provided Drew with a perspective on the incident that he had never considered. His decision to operate despite Patterson's racial preferences had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate medical situation. Later that week, Drew traveled to the White House for his meeting with President Truman. The president had a reputation for direct conversation and decisive action, qualities that Drew hoped would lead to practical solutions rather than political rhetoric. "Drew, I've been following your situation with great interest. It seems to me that you've demonstrated something important about the relationship between competence and prejudice in American institutions." Truman's opening comment suggested that he understood the broader implications of the Walter Reed incident and was prepared to address them at a policy level. "Mr. President, I hope that my actions can contribute to discussions about improving medical care for all Americans, regardless of race or background." "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you, Dr. Drew. I'm considering an executive order that would integrate all federal medical facilities, including military hospitals. Your experience suggests that such integration would improve medical outcomes rather than compromise them." This was a more dramatic proposal than Drew had anticipated. Federal integration of medical facilities would be a major step toward eliminating racial barriers in healthcare, but it would also generate significant political opposition. "Mr. President, I believe that integration based on medical competence would indeed improve healthcare outcomes. However, I think it's important that such policies be implemented gradually and with proper training to ensure that they succeed." Truman nodded thoughtfully. "Dr. Drew, what would you recommend as the best approach for implementing such integration?" Drew had given considerable thought to this question since the Walter Reed incident, and he outlined a comprehensive plan that focused on demonstrated competence rather than racial quotas. "President, I would suggest beginning with emergency medical situations where competence is clearly the primary consideration. From there, integration could expand to other medical specialties based on proven performance and patient outcomes." The conversation with President Truman lasted nearly 2 hours, covering not only medical integration but also Drew's research in blood banking and its applications for both military and civilian medicine. By the end of the meeting, Drew felt that he had successfully focused the discussion on medical rather than purely political considerations. "Dr. Drew, I want you to work with my staff to develop specific recommendations for federal medical integration. I think your experience gives you unique insights into how such policies can be implemented effectively." This request represented both an extraordinary opportunity and a significant responsibility. Drew would be helping to shape federal policy that could affect millions of Americans for decades to come. 3 months later, Drew stood before a congressional committee alongside General Patterson to testify about military medical practices and racial integration. The hearing room was packed with reporters, medical professionals, and civil rights advocates, all eager to hear how the two men would present their shared experience. Patterson testified first, describing the medical emergency and Drew's surgical intervention with remarkable candor. Members of the committee, Dr. Payton, Drew performed surgery that saved my life using techniques that few physicians in the world have mastered. The quality of medical care I received was exceptional by any standard, and my recovery has been complete. The general then addressed the broader implications of the incident with a directness that surprised many observers. I want to be clear that my initial objections to Dr. Drew's involvement were based on personal prejudices rather than medical considerations. Those prejudices were proven wrong by the excellent care I received and my complete recovery. When Drew testified, he focused on the medical and scientific aspects of the case rather than the racial controversy. Honorable members, the techniques used in General Patterson's surgery represent advances in vascular surgery that have taken years to develop. The success of the operation demonstrates that medical competence should be the primary criterion for physician selection, particularly in emergency situations. Drew then presented data showing that integrated medical facilities in other countries had achieved better patient outcomes than segregated systems, providing scientific evidence to support policy recommendations. The congressional hearing was widely covered in the national media, and the testimony by both Drew and Patterson helped shift public discussion from inflammatory racial rhetoric to practical considerations about medical effectiveness. 6 months after the Walter Reed incident, President Truman signed Executive Order 9980, which integrated all federal medical facilities and established competence-based criteria for medical personnel assignments. The order specifically cited the Walter Reed case as evidence that racial integration could improve rather than compromise medical care. The policy changes had immediate and far-reaching effects. Black physicians and nurses gained access to federal medical facilities where they could practice alongside white colleagues, leading to improved training opportunities and career advancement. More importantly, patients in federal facilities received access to the best available medical care, regardless of the racial background of their healthcare providers. Drew's role in these policy changes brought him national recognition that extended far beyond the medical community. He was invited to speak at universities, medical conferences, and civil rights organizations across the country. However, he consistently emphasized medical competence over racial politics in his presentations. The international opportunities that had emerged from the Walter Reed incident also came to fruition. Drew's collaboration with Jonas Salk on vaccine preservation techniques led to breakthrough methods for maintaining vaccine stability in tropical climates. These innovations made it possible to implement vaccination programs in developing countries where such programs had previously been impossible. Drew's work with the United Nations on global health initiatives took him to Africa, Asia, and South America, where he helped establish blood banking systems and trained local medical personnel in advanced surgical techniques. These international programs saved thousands of lives and established Drew as a pioneer in global health medicine. The Mayo Clinic presentation that had resulted from the Walter Reed publicity led to widespread adoption of Drew's blood banking techniques in civilian hospitals. By 1950, hospitals across the United States and Europe were using modified versions of Drew's methods, dramatically improving their ability to provide emergency medical care. Perhaps most significantly, the Walter Reed incident had demonstrated that racial integration in medicine could work successfully when based on competence rather than political ideology. Medical schools began recruiting more qualified minority students, and hospitals started hiring physicians and nurses based on their training and skills rather than their race. General Patterson, whose life had been saved by Drew's intervention, became an unexpected advocate for racial integration in the military. He used his influence within the military hierarchy to promote policies that evaluated personnel based on competence rather than racial background. Patterson's advocacy was particularly effective because it was based on personal experience rather than abstract principles. The partnership between Drew and Patterson evolved into a lasting friendship that surprised both men. They discovered that their shared commitment to excellence in their respective professions created common ground that transcended their different backgrounds and previous beliefs. 5 years after the Walter Reed incident, Drew received a letter from a young black medical student at Harvard University. The student, who would later become a prominent surgeon himself, wrote that Drew's example had inspired him to pursue a career in medicine despite the barriers he faced. Dr. Drew, your courage in performing that surgery and the dignified way you handled the controversy afterward showed me that it was possible to excel in medicine while maintaining one's principles. Your example has guided my own career and given me hope for the future of American medicine. Drew received hundreds of similar letters over the years from young physicians, both black and white, who had been inspired by his example to pursue careers dedicated to medical excellence rather than limited by racial considerations. The scientific legacy of Drew's work continued to grow long after the immediate controversy had faded. His techniques for blood preservation were adapted for organ transplantation, making complex surgeries possible that had previously been impossible. His research in vascular surgery contributed to advances in cardiac surgery and neurosurgery that saved countless lives. By the time of Drew's death in 1950, he had established himself as one of the most important medical researchers of his generation. His innovations in blood banking had saved hundreds of thousands of lives during World War II and continued to be used in hospitals worldwide. His advocacy for competence-based medical integration had helped break down racial barriers in American healthcare. The Walter Reed incident, which had begun as a simple emergency surgery, had evolved into a catalyst for fundamental changes in American medicine. Drew's decision to prioritize medical necessity over racial preferences had demonstrated that excellence in healthcare required the best qualified personnel, regardless of their background. The plaque that was eventually installed at Walter Reed Army Medical Center commemorated not just Drew's surgical skill, but the broader lesson of the incident, that saving lives requires the courage to look beyond prejudice to find the best in human capability. General Patterson, who lived for many years after his surgery, often spoke about the incident as a turning point in his understanding of racial issues. He credited Drew not just with saving his life, but with opening his eyes to the talents and capabilities of people he had previously dismissed based on prejudice. The story of that night at Walter Reed became a legend in American medicine, taught to generations of medical students as an example of the physician's duty to preserve life above all other considerations. More than that, it became a powerful demonstration that competence and character matter more than the artificial barriers that society sometimes creates. The ultimate legacy of Drew's decision was not just the life he saved that night, but the countless lives that were saved in subsequent years by the integration of American medicine that his actions had helped to inspire. In choosing to be a physician first and accepting the consequences of that choice, Drew had changed not only one man's fate, but the direction of American healthcare for generations to come. When young medical students today learn about Charles Drew, they learn not just about his scientific innovations in blood banking, but about the night when he proved that excellence in medicine requires the courage to do what is right, regardless of the personal cost. It was a lesson that transformed American medicine and demonstrated the power of individual action to change the world. The general had called for the best surgeon, and when he couldn't believe his eyes, he learned something about the true meaning of medical excellence that would influence American healthcare for decades to come. In the end, that may have been the most important surgery Charles Drew ever performed, not just on a patient's body, but on a nation's conscience.